Now my sermon passage this morning is Romans chapter 14, verses 1 to 12, and it's page 453 in the Pew Bible. The Apostle Paul continues, "Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the day observe it in honor of the Lord, and those who eat, eat in honor of the Lord, since they give thanks to God. While those who abstain, abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? Why do you despise your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, 'As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God.' So then each of us will be accountable to God." Here ends the reading of these words inspired by God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for understanding. You gotta love good old Paul. His confidence is so strong and he gets so excited that what he writes seems to be clear even when it's not. This looks to me like a checklist of do's and don'ts. Just eat vegetables, or eat what you want, or celebrate this day, or not. Whatever you do, just be sure, or as he put it, let all be fully convinced in their own minds. There's Paul's confidence right there. Being fully convinced, though, doesn't usually lead to peaceful relations with others, especially those who are, quote, convinced in their own minds in another direction. I think the Apostle Paul opened up a can of worms here, so we're going to have to deal with worms this morning. Now there's an awful lot of me in what I'm about to say and in this sermon, and it's more than I'm used to, but it's just the way it happened. For me to tell these stories, I had to tell these stories. About 35 years ago, this passage and another one similar opened up cans of worms for me by the six-pack. Mama was a teetotaler. No beer, no wine, no nothing, ever. She was convinced in her own mind. Daddy was of another mind. Out of respect for Mama, I guess, or to stay out of arguments, probably both. He never brought alcohol into the house as far as I know. But he'd make regular trips into town to get his hose sharpened. He was a farmer. Wink, wink. Or he'd go into town to have some welding done on something. Wink, wink. Now the hose would come back sharpened, and the something would come back welded, but he'd also come back feeling a little better, with his aches and pains eased. My brother and I are convinced that lots of folks took a nip now and then, and maybe today, for the same reason that half of this country is on pain pills now, whether prescribed or not, for their aches and pains. Back then, there wasn't 1,000 pain relievers on every shelf of the corner drugstore. Granny Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies, she was onto something with the rheumatism medicine, which is what she called moonshine. Well, Daddy kept his rheumatism medicine stashed in the toolboxes on his tractors, or in this barn, or in that one between the walls, between the inside of the walls, or in the attic of the old milking parlor in our old milk barn. And only he and the Lord know where else. Not long after Daddy died in 1989, my brother and I went across the farm, the old farm place, looking. And we found 2 or 3 dusty old pine bottles, pine jars. They were at least 20 years old. because he was in poor health for at least that long. So there's just some background on how I used to read Romans 14 and other passages having to do with conflicting customs and social habits in the early church. I chose sides. I counted myself with Daddy among those who, quote, believe in eating anything, and anything included beer. Now, that was one of the great social divides in Oklahoma when I was a teenager and a young man, partly because they kept messing with the drinking age. For years, women could buy 3-2 beer in Oklahoma at age 18, but men could not until age 21. That sounds crazy today. In 1976, the legal age went to 18 for both women and men. So when I turned 18 on May 2nd in 1982, I was legal for 16 and a half months. Because on September 22nd, 1983, the legal age went up to 21 for everybody. Now, do you remember or know what else was going on about that same time? The military draft had ended in 1973, and selective service registration ended in 75. But then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and President Carter reinstituted the selective service registration in 1980. So within 30 days of me turning 18, on May 2nd, 82, I had to register for selective service. And some of us boys were convinced that we were going to be drafted. We all had older brothers or people that we knew who had served in Vietnam. And we were paying attention because we were signing a pledge, right, to respond to the draft. And we were convinced, at the height of the Cold War especially, we thought the draft was about to start again. So in the space of 16 and a half months from May 82 to September 83, I went from being legal to drink to illegal to drink, but I had to register for the draft, I thought, at the height of the Cold War. It seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, to be terribly unfair. It took me a while to figure out why I was so angry and defiant. It was never just about beer. It was about rights and responsibilities and liberty and obligation under the law. But not in church. No, in church it was always and only about drinking. As to the changes in those laws, I was, as Paul put it, fully convinced in my own mind. The idea of being legal for war and not legal to buy beer still appalls me. But in church I was torn. And that's what Paul's talking about in this passage. What people do in church and what people in church think about and how they act around people with ideas and customs and practices different from their own. Because I was a church boy. Welcome those who are weak in faith, Paul wrote. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. And I read it this way. The weak were the teetotalers, those whose concept of church or faith could not abide a social drinker, or who could not see the injustice that I felt. And so while my impulse was to assert my rights, I had an equal impulse to not be a stumbling block to someone with weak faith. I didn't despise those who abstained, but the fact is that those who did abstain did pass judgment in defiance of Paul's instructions. And I chalked that up as being part of their weakness. See how twisted this stuff can get? This judging one another? And it gets weirder. I was worried that my liberty might become a stumbling block to the weak. Well, I came to the conclusion that it was all about appearances. See, there's another place where Paul talks about this, something similar anyway, and it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. It caused conflict and misunderstanding. On one hand, there were Christians who had no qualms about eating meat from animals that had been sacrificed to other gods because they knew there weren't any other gods. They were just empty idols and lifeless statues. And on the other hand, in Corinth, were Christians who had been worshipers of these non-gods, and they had been so immersed in that to eat meat sacrificed to them, or to see their fellow Jesus people eating that meat, it wounded their conscience, as Paul put it. It messed up their faith. And Paul cautioned against that. For if others see you eating that meat, might they not, since their conscience is weak, be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? thereby hurting their conscience and their faith even more, causing them to doubt, causing them to wonder, maybe I should go back to those false gods. Well, I seized on see. For if others see you, Paul said. So it's all about appearances, I said. I mean, really, because Paul knows, and those with strong faith know, that there's no reason not to eat that meat, because whatever they thought they were doing, they weren't worshiping gods, because they aren't gods. So they just need to get over it. They need to update their conscience, so there. So I was sharing this wonderful loophole I'd found, this insight, I was sharing this spiritual insight that I'd found with my brother way back then. And he said, "Are you telling me that if no one sees you drinking, it's okay?" Well, yeah. well, yeah, but there's a problem with that. It makes snakes out of people. Daddy stashed away his ache and pain medicine. Granny Clampett called moonshine her rheumatism medicine. And I took to the dirt roads and down to the river bottoms and up to the hills, north of where we grew up. Lots of us country kids did. Now, some of us went to church and we loved Jesus and we loved one another and we loved our Sunday school teachers and our preachers and our deacons, but we snuck to the bottoms with six-packs, defying a custom of alcohol abstinence that we did not understand and that we thought was fundamentally unfair, again, because of the draft potential and selective service. Now, I could not have articulated that probably quite like that back then, but I knew I was angry and I couldn't figure out why. And I wondered why I was so defiant, because I was a church kid, but I defied that. Now, was it right for me to sneak around like that? Probably not, surely not. But Christian liberty is real. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. And sadly, it didn't work both ways. Something else is real. Our obligation to not become stumbling blocks to one another. My surely faulty solution was to hide what I was doing, not out of shame, but frankly, yes, to avoid conflict. I eventually left that church and I left that tradition to avoid conflict and to lessen my chances of becoming a stumbling block, among many other reasons. Now, I picked a pretty contentious example to illustrate what I think Paul's getting at here. Contentious but true to my life and to others my age. We don't always know why people are the way they are in church. We don't always know why people do what they do. That's why we're urged not to judge. We don't know what we don't know. There are other things that church people, honest, earnest followers of Jesus, can disagree on, and that's fine. But we fall into passing judgment on one another, and that's not fine. It happens in progressive churches and among usually open-minded progressive Christians, as well as in other churches. Here's an example from the Progressive Christian page on Facebook. This notice popped up day before yesterday. Isms reminder. The administrative team for this group has a zero-tolerance policy for prejudicial rhetoric that includes any of the following: ableism, ageism, cisgenderism, classism, racism, and sexism. Well, I had to guess at what ableism is. It's discrimination or prejudice against people with disabilities. Who does that? I don't know. Within a Christian environment, maybe they do. And I had to look up cisgenderism, and I'm still not sure what it means. I think it's discrimination or prejudice against people whose gender lines up with their actual biological sex. I'm a man, I was raised a man, I am a man. People discriminate against that. I don't understand it. I didn't know that was a thing. But woe unto me if I accidentally, because I didn't know, were to say something to offend someone. The zero tolerance policy struck me as ironic and not very Jesus-y. Now, the goal was to keep the Progressive Christianity Facebook page as a safe place for people who have been harassed and abused by other people who have ignored God's call not to judge other believers. I understand that. But zero tolerance is pretty judgmental by definition, I think. They're working it out. Lots of people weighed in, and this is my 2 cents that I contributed. As a pastor, I caution against rushes to judgment. People are on their own journeys as God leads and as they listen, understand, and respond. A real troublemaker will become obvious before too long. There's no reason or justification for a zero-tolerance attitude. People learn at different paces. As we say in the United Church of Christ, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. And that's where I start. As long as it's not obvious that someone is deliberately being disruptive, and as long as it's possible that they may actually just be on earlier steps toward what we think of as Jesus-iness or progressive thinking or whatever, I say give them the benefit of the doubt. Very few of us got where we are now all at once. Finally, this sort of thing, church people judging other church people, is so easy to slip into. Somebody likes this hymnal, somebody likes the other hymnal is one thing. The red hymnal may have a song that your mama sang, and it may be in that hymnal just the way she sung it, and I can say that about the old rugged cross, actually. And the black hymnal may speak to your sense of social justice, and that's true of me as well. For me to like one hymnal better is one thing. And for me to think less of you because you like the other one better is wrong. I am not saying that that happens out there. I'm sure that it happens in some churches because of the very nature of the New Century hymnal. It is a social justice-oriented hymnal. And I want to end with a very personal thing. I know that some people in this beloved church dislike this. They can't stand that I preach from a manuscript. I'm worried that some think less of me, and that may be fine. It's based on certain experiences and preferences. And I'm sorry. I have had terrible experiences with preachers that don't preach from texts or notes. They're the ones that go on and round and they never say much, or they say things that they really shouldn't, or they say things that they actually regret if they admit it. And they take 45 or 50 minutes to say it, because that's what happens when you speak off the cuff without sideboards. These are my sideboards. That's been my experience. And so my preference is to write it out, even if I go off script sometimes. These things are so potentially dangerous to the life and function of a church if we don't think of the other first. It can easily tumble into that quarreling over opinions that Paul warned about. Lines get drawn and sides get chosen, and then each side thinks the other is the weak. Lord, help us not get drawn into that kind of thinking. Oh God, whether we eat or drink anything or not, whether we stumble into this ism or that ism, whether we like this hymnal or that one, or this kind of preaching or the other kind, may we all come together to give thanks to God. We don't always know why others are the way they are, and we don't always know why people do the things they do. May we not live to ourselves. May we live to the Lord. We must live to the Lord so we can live for others. Amen.